Someone shot the food.
Good evening. Wow. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the History of the World. Despite what the intro theme and the banner might be telling you on the beginning of the show, I just don't have the other elements ready, so I wanted to go in without having all of the awkwardness of me just starting talking over a black screen. So here we go. Welcome to the History of the World. This is part one. Where we're going to talk about the very beginning of what can be considered video games. I'm Slacker Kai Travis, whatever the heck you want to call me, and I'm pushing the buttons. And of course, I have Brian, aka Wonder Boy, with me as well.
Yes, I am here, and I will just make this point real quick in terms of aesthetics here. What better way to introduce the beginning of video game history than by spawning from the blackness that all history has spawned from? From nothing we came, from nothing we will return. Tennis for two, anyone? Video games.
By spawning for nothing, you mean Georgia? Is that?
Yo! Fuck you, I was born in the carpet capital of the world. That's not nothing. Shout out Dalton. Never shout out Dalton. The only thing good there's the Steak and Shake, and that's marginal.
I was born down the street from the largest meth lab bust of the 1990s.
Yo, let's talk about meth. Alright, anyway.
Alright, so, we're gonna go way the hell back in time and go back to literally the turn of the last century to the 1900s. Just so you have an idea of what was going on at the time. So, of course, you had, your stuff like playing cards, which is basically the PlayStation of the early era. And you had games of chance, right? Your, hey, can you knock over these milk balls or get this item in a ring or, your cornhole or what have you were all... Yeah. And pool was, of course, also a fairly big thing. And pool is oddly what leads us directly into what can be considered like the first electronic game. Not video game, but yeah, that whole electronic thing. So... This...
Hello YouTube, 7 Sigma here.
Let me mute this guy. No, go back. I'm very good at pushing buttons, by the way. That's my whole job here, and I'm not pushing them correctly.
It happens.
This is a Bagatelle board. This is... it originated based on the concept of pool, of getting a ball into a hole, but here instead, you have a ball that you just shoot out using... the spring-loaded mechanism at the bottom right-hand corner, which you might recognize where that is going, pins and a ball. And the whole job is just to get the ball to go into the holes, and you're manually scoring at this point. And this was apparently a big old thing at the early 1900s, this game of Bagatelle. It went damn near everywhere, and these were highly popular games of skill. I just want to show the guy real quick launching off a bagatelle ball. It's so... it's almost quaint in its own way, but it's kind of cool. I also wish this guy was not blocking the shot in so much, but yeah. You know, when
No,
you're...
like, sorry, go ahead.
When you're talking about, like, historical action-adventure stuff, you know, there's not a whole lot of video to display on that stuff. And, hey, nothing shows it better than a video of it in use rather than a static image.
No, that's very true. And honestly, like, this is interesting because, like, you know, obviously, like, there was I didn't know the name of this thing before, but, like, I think we've all seen one of these or experienced something like this before, you know, whether it be like, you know, I think it's basically been reduced now to like one of those like cheap like party favor games that you'll get for like a kid's birthday party or something,
Mm-hmm.
like the little plastic version of this. But I remember having a ball with this style of stuff back in the day, and of course, like, that was basically common knowledge knowing what this leads to.
Yeah.
Like, it fed into the idea of what pinball would come to be in that way. And it's interesting that that this device itself, the Bagatelle, has survived even as pinball kind of took its ideas and evolved on them in a way.
Yeah, it's definitely been dominated since that time. While certainly they still exist to this day, especially like, growing up, I can remember going to my grandma's house and she had a game very similar to that. And that was cool as hell when I was a kid. But yeah, these were fairly common to find around a house, basically. They were just a fun little single-shot game. And they actually led to what is referred to as the penny arcade. Basically a version of this that had mechanically driven balls that you could play for a whole penny. It's, it baffles the mind as well. Like, you hear the term penny arcade and like, oh yeah, I understand what that means. No, it's literally an arcade you take your pennies to. But this eventually led to stuff like Baffle Ball, which, same idea, and this one is a little bit more expensive at a whole nickel to play this guy here. But this was also like something you would see at the penny arcades. Actually, I think it was the Blue Ribbon that first came in a nickel. This was still at the penny margin, I believe. But either way, you would see this at the penny arcades, and it looks like a baseball field, and you're trying to get as many points as you can within this little thing. And yet again, this coming out of that era, fairly common in what you would consider your penny arcades, your midways, etc.
It's interesting to see how they're already using like the ideas of like popular culture, or like what's popular beyond just like these devices, to really influence how they design them going forward.
Oh yeah, you had to, since the market was so... Hey John Borg, how's it going? Since the market was so saturated at the time, right, you had to stand out somehow and get people's attention. So, if you could do a baseball theme instead, that's way cooler than just having the game itself, right? It looks way more interesting than just a bare board.
Yeah, it definitely does. It's just intriguing to me because, like, seeing the route that, I keep jumping to pinball even though we haven't gotten to it yet. But like, obviously this is the stepping stone there. It's just it's just very interesting to me to see like how pinball evolved to basically be defined by the licenses and the pop culture references that a lot of the machines were like patterned after, or themed after rather, especially from like the 70s on. and to see that idea was already kind of manifesting in the 30s, whenever like actual what we know as pinball now had not really been, widely available at all. It's just interesting to see like the mechanic, the thought processes, and how they're mirrored.
Yeah, and yet again, it's one of those things. When you say the word pinball, oh, I know pinball. Pin, ball. Like, it just blows my mind. Oh, yeah, shit. It was just pin and ball. That was what they had. But around the turn of the 30s, you had two fairly large people come into play. One of them, Harry Williams, who would go on to found Williams Pinball, which is huge to this day as a company. Of course, Harry Williams no longer, with us or in charge of it. It's more of a name brand than anything. But in the 30s, he was the first to add an electronic scoring, not seen in this video, but this is also, an important evolution where you see more mechanics actually driven into the game, and you see a continuation of these games having motifs, this one being, car racing motif. But he was the first to add actual electronic scoring pockets to keep the score for you. This one also kept score for you, but this was more mechanically driven. And, of course, the expensive nickel game that really blew the world of pinball out of the water was Contact, which I believe was a Bally product. Quote me here if I'm wrong, but Williams and Bally would be the two largest names in pinball for ages to come after this. And this game was the first to ever introduce actual electric lights and bumpers, sort of becoming the pinball game we would eventually know. Of course, flippers and other things would come in later. But you look at this, rather than what we had previously, like, you can kind of see the other one being a pinball board, but you see this is a pinball board.
Yeah, like the layering, like just seeing like the one idea and then the next idea just kind of compounding onto one another until things start to take shape in a more recognizable way for us. This is interesting. This is intriguing to me because I had never heard of Contact. I'd heard of Blue Ribbon. I'd never heard of Contact. So like this board like is crazy to me. And I'm not gonna lie, when I first started watching this video, like I thought that those were those vertical slots down there were flippers, and I was like, why would they have vertical flippers on this? Obviously, that's not it, but like still, this is crazy to think like this just how closely this resembles pinball boards, and it's like what, really like 40 years ahead of whenever those things would really take shape in the way that we know them.
Yeah, it was mostly the 70s that the pinball board became the pinball board, but this was the way they looked for probably like 20 to 30 years, other than the addition of flippers eventually came in. But this is, it's distinguishable from a modern pinball board, but not by a whole lot, really, other than, now we just have the one hole at the bottom, and you're not doing skill shots to hit that hole. You may have holes for other sorts of things, but, yeah. Just for funsies, I hit the next anyway to the 1978 version of Contact, and boy, that is a different beast entirely. Oh, that is a long way to go. Now, honestly, there's a lot, obviously, that happened in the middle with pinball, but following that is it's less interesting than the beginning as well. we kind of have more things that are interesting, and not a whole lot genuinely happens in the sphere of the midway for a while. You're talking things like skee ball, pinball, other light and sound contraptions, but they're still largely mechanical rather than electronic, just with the lights and sounds and stuff. So, we're going to move ahead a little bit to talking about Alan Turing. And boy, I would love to go way deeper on Alan Turing, but frankly, it would make this show impossibly long.
We can go as deep as you wanna. Like we have time constraints for individual shows, and we have no time constraints on how far we want to explore this stuff.
Understandable. Also, man, the information on Alan Turing is dense, and as you might imagine, the man had a lot of stuff that was not related to video games that would need to be gone through.
Check it out. Also, real quick, at some point down the line, we need to come back and revisit the pinball gambling issues.
Oh, absolutely.
that went along with that, because that is a wild story.
Yeah, totally. So, when you talk about what is the first video game, it's a really good question of what is a video game, right? And really, it kind of has to be something that physically exists, is playable, is built for entertainment, and is interactive primarily through a visual device. I'll kind of hit on it a bit later, but there is a fucking amazing video, maybe my favorite video on video games of all time, from a channel called Ahoy, that covers what is the first video game, and starts going back, starting from how we used to know it. Like in the 80s, it was, oh yeah, of course, Pong was like the first one. Well, wait, no, it was this, and then this, and then this. So he goes back and mentions this one, and we got a little extra here from thehistoryofinformation.com. Going into this is a concept that was never actually made, but even in 1947, they were considering, well, what could we do with these cathode rays machines that have suddenly hit the world? Well, we could make a game resembling a radar display, but with airplanes and all that cool stuff. And it was an idea. It was, as far as we know, never built. But this was the first ever mention of an idea of playing a game using an electronic screen that dates all the way back to 1947 with Goldsmith and Mann. But nothing actually came of it. There were a lot of games that used electronic devices that you could not call video games as well in the very early 1950s. One of the most popular ones was the game called Nimrod. That was just a machine at the Canadian World's Fair where you played a game of... you had a screen of lights, and you had to turn off the lights that would change the off-on of the lights around it, like blackout, basically, against a machine that would turn off the lights in exchange with you, and basically to see who would win. Yeah, it was
almost like a competitive Minesweeper almost.
Yeah,
in some ways.
But it was mostly mechanical still, and it still doesn't really count even with all that, since it's not actually a graphical output. We're talking, just a ray of lights as far as the game is concerned. But it was groundbreaking for the time, for sure, and killed it at the Canadian World's Fair. So this is where we get into Alan Turing himself, as I mentioned before. And this from History.com, speaking on how he created basically what we consider the first AI. Now, Alan Turing, I believe most everyone knows the famous Alan Turing. He's the one that built the bomb, the machine that deciphered the German. Why am I not thinking the name of it? The Enigma machine that would make German intel concepts. And his research was largely hidden for a long time. He was a gay man in the UK at a time that was not allowable legally. And he was eventually chemically castrated, and on that he killed himself from cyanide, and all of his research was lost for ages. There's just this black hole where all of the amazing things he created disappeared for ages. But he was one of the first people interested in the idea of computer science. Now, when you're talking a program in the 40s or 50s, from that, you're more talking like a mathematical program, right? You're talking, here's a series of steps that, if performed in a specific manner, programmatically ends up in a resolution. And he was the first one to consider, well, I can make an AI based on a program, referring to the algorithm as TurboChamp, and began writing it as soon as the early 40s, after the war was over.
That's crazy to me that you even already be thinking about these sort of like programs this early in the. I mean, let's face it. This is the infancy of computing.
Oh, absolutely, and you have to understand, before he had a computer to work on, he was working on this concept of an AI, regardless. And the first thing he thought of to do with it was to make an AI that could play a game of chess. It wouldn't be a very good game of chess, mind you, because Turing himself, notoriously not a great chess player, but that wasn't really the idea here. It would evaluate the next two moves possible out of all of the moves available, and then out of a certain numerical computation, would decide which one of these moves was the best move to make currently. So it couldn't think extremely far ahead, but it did think ahead. He first worked on a machine known as, the Ferranti Mark I, was where he began working on this in earnest. And at first, it would just give you, after 30 minutes of time, it would give you a printout of the next move you should make with this AI that he built. And he played it against a friend, Alec Glennie. He was able to play a whole game of chess using TurboChamp. It lost, but it still played the whole game through. It still made the predictions that it could. So this is literally your first AI to ever exist. Within his lifespan, Turing never actually got the computer to run it with the graphical output. Eventually would be done after his demise. Afterwards it would be ran, but he never actually got to see it fully ran on the Ferranti Mark I that he worked so diligently on. Passing near his 42nd birthday. Meanwhile, Gary Kasparov, and honestly I'm just going to I just sat and watched while I was in the middle of investigating. I looked for some videos of Mr. Kasparov, and ran across this TED talk talking about all of his plays with machines. And it's just an amazing TED talk. It stopped in the middle of my researching to watch this, and it's really great. Don't Fear Intelligent Machines, Work With Them by Gary Kasparov. But years later, this machine would be brought back to life after famously Gary Kasparov played Deep Blue. They made the code for TurboChamp work using modern computers in order for him to play against TurboChamp. Obviously, he beat the hell out of TurboChamp, but still, it was interesting to watch. It was in the 90s, so watching a 60-year-old program play a game of chess. And to go ahead.
Sorry, I was saying that's just crazy to me, to know that code written in like 1950, and that Alan Turing actually sat there like with the paper in hand, working through the algorithm like manually to play a game of chess to prove out that his thing worked. Whenever inserted into a computer program in the 90s, that it worked. Like that's just bewildering. Like, it's just so fascinating. Like it really. I mean, I'm fairly familiar with Alan Turing's story, and you know, his fate is one of the saddest ones, coming out of that time period, honestly, and it's extremely painful, especially you know, as a member of the LGBTQ community. It really sucks. But I love the fact that his work is being recognized, not just recognized for being as ahead of its time, and as it is, but that it's still applicable in many ways. Like just the fact that he wrote this like very like compared to today simple algorithmic code for a chess game, where it turns out you basically turn the computer into a mediocre chess player, like my level chess player. And the fact that it's just, I don't know how to put it into words. It's just astounding to me that it actually worked.
Yeah, it functions exactly as Alan Turing meant it to. On if you take a look at the Ferranti Mark 1 here, each of these cabinets is another series of relays here. This whole room is the Ferranti Mark 1. You're talking $150,000 at the time to build one of these.
Back when you had to have a room in your house dedicated solely to your computer.
Oh, screw a room in your house. This had a very limited run, obviously, to be built. It was mostly built at universities of the time. So you had to be at a university to make this. So, it was fascinating that a lot of the very early adopters used it to, in some extents, make some games just as to prove a point of AI at the time.
Well, I mean, it makes sense. Like, I would say that's probably one of the more straightforward ways of proving out AI.
True.
Yeah.
So what you might say is, okay, that's well and good that he built this AI, but I thought you were going to talk about the first video game and how Alan Turing made it. Oh ho ho. Let's talk about Christopher Strahe. He studied with Alan Turing at King's College. That's also where the Ferranti Mark 1 was. He, during his time there, began work on a program just basically called Draughts. So it's the same as checkers. That's how the UK refers to as checkers. And it is just a computer that will play a game of checkers alongside or against you. And he spent the better part of his time there. First, he met Alan Turing. He showed him his concepts and ideas, and Turing would eventually both give him some lessons on his own, but as well, some of his own programming would go to Strahi to get him moving forward as well. The program that he wrote for Drotz at the time was the longest piece of code in history, at 1,000 instructions. You're talking on, those old dot matrix print cards, right? That you have to, clamp out in order to run. So in order to run a game of chess, you're feeding 1,000 of those little papers into the machine. Which is freaking nuts. But he was able to get that game of Drotz to work, and we know this because that is what his graduation research paper was based on. So clearly it had to work as at least a proof of concept in some form of fashion, or he couldn't have graduated. But that is how Alan Turing directly led to the work that Strahi would eventually do. And this man, frankly, had the career that Turing should have had. If you continue to read the history of him from history.computer.org here, the dude just continued to be a visionary and a luminary within the computing field for decades to come, eventually retiring to teach, but frankly, this man had the life Turing should have had, and it's remarkable but sad at the same time that he was able to follow the process, Strahi himself, from the beginning of when computing was available to the time that the microprocessor was eventually created and everyone got to have a computer. A lot of that came from his work.
So, question for you. How closely derivative or related to Turing's TurboChamp algorithm was how do you pronounce this name? I'm sorry.
I believe it's Strahi. If I'm
Strahi,
wrong,
okay.
I'm remembering that from my way gone college classes. So
No worries. I just want to double check and make sure. Anyway, so like how derivative or like based off of the TurboChamp algorithm was Strahi's Drotz program?
I wouldn't say very directly derivative of it. He already had the concept pinned out for it. It was a matter of just getting the algorithm that he developed to work on, the Ferranti Mark I. So getting that to work, the first couple of times that he attempted it were failures. We do know what eventually ran. But anybody that's ever coded before, you could kind of think of from the documents that I've read of Turing kind of being his rubber duck to ask questions of and kind of figure out where he was failing, and also the donation of the code that Turing did run on the Ferranti Mark I. I wouldn't say really he directly cribbed it per se, but it definitely would have helped him in figuring out why parts of his programming didn't run on the machine properly.
And excuse me. And I don't ask that question necessarily to see like if Strahi like just took Turing and ran with it, but it's more so just like how they influenced one another in that way. Like it's interesting that you kind of refer to Turing as Strahi's like rubber duck in that instance,
Hmm.
because like it. I mean, obviously you have two brilliant minds when it comes to computer science here, just bouncing these ideas, whether it be necessarily off of one another, but at least one person bouncing their ideas off of the other
Yeah.
in that way to get to a place where you have a working program, even though it is 1,000 reams long.
Yeah, and Turing at this time was, mostly working as a professor. So, you're kind of looking at this as a professor helping one of these students. I don't think he directly taught Strahi, but, they both worked on the same machine, and both helped basically to formulate what a program was, which is just weird to think of, but. Alright, I mentioned earlier my absolute favorite video of all time on gaming in the very early days, and I recommend watching this guy, Ahoy, with the first video game. Um, it's absolutely killer the amount of research this man goes into. I don't know how he found some of the facts he did. I'm going to say outright that I would not have bothered to look into the work of Christopher Strahi on the Ferranti Mark One, if not for mentioned here. Like he had been mentioned in programming classes previously, when talking about the history of things as one of the founders of AI. But this video sets up 5 concepts for how do you describe what a video game is, and their presumptions I can find no holes in. It has to exist as a practical implementation. It must generate a video signal. You must have interactions that in some capacity alter that signal. It must practically be intended for entertainment and be primarily playable through a video display. Now, for the longest time, EDSEC, the American computer, kind of similar to the British Ferranti Mark One, was considered the birth of. Oh, I have the wrong input for the EDSEC. Oh well, whatever. I can talk about that.
No worries.
The EDSEC was basically the American version of the Ferranti Mark One. I mean, they did basically the same thing, though. The EDSEC was a little bit faster than the Ferranti Mark One. You're still talking punch card routines and a very basic output mechanism. When people talked about the first video games in a previous time, first off, there was a game called Sheeps and Draughts. Basically, it would draw a line down the middle of the screen with 2 possible holes, with a line moving across the screen that represented your sheep, and you had to open the correct gate for the sheep to go through. It could potentially be considered the first video game, but because of the fact that it literally just displayed as a series of lights rather than a video screen, Ahoy sees that as not being a quote-unquote video game. But the other item to come out of EDSEC, OXO, was also around literally the same time. You're talking all of this work, the Ferranti Mark One, and the OXO and all of that were in 1951-52. Let me just see if I can... Yeah, fairly easy to find a good display of OXO, and you get the idea here.
There's your basic 1950s era graphics.
Yeah, this is
There
the
we-
EDSEC. None of that nice hiding behind cabinets and shit here. This is all out in the open for you to see.
Let it all air out. Honestly, they probably needed all that to keep everything cool.
Probably true. The inputs for this, they used a rotary dial to represent each one of these areas. And the interesting thing, you see these 3 screens back here, these weren't actually meant to display outputs. They were meant to display how the process was going. And your output was a paper machine output. But they used the display instead of showing memory and how it was being registered. They used the display instead to show the tic-tac-toe board.
How are they able to kind of manipulate the visual display in that way?
That I don't know. That's some old voodoo that is way beyond my years. I read a couple things about like how it worked, and it's before my time.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, there's a lot about the EDSEC that is beyond my reach. Even like, but also I have a very like minimal knowledge of coding or programming at all to begin with, even with modern era stuff. So
Yeah, punch cards. I don't, know exactly how they function that well, but using a telephone rotary dial to control your interaction with a 35 by 16 dot matrix cathode ray tube. That is goddamn impressive for 1952, and literally this is at odds with the time that Draughts took place. Draughts, honestly, the more complicated game between the two, so it wins on that factor too, but this, I would say, is easier to interact with. So as far as being something a regular human could play, as long as you remember the numbers correlation on the game board, fairly easy for a standard person to play. Okay, so we're going to start to actually get into more of a time that people might have more data really on.
yeah,
Good old Tennis for Two. This was a game that was never meant really to be anything. This was just a way to show what they were doing. The Brookhaven National Laboratory, back in the mid-50s, would show off their technical prowess every year by putting their hardware on display, and it bored the shit out of everyone. Electronically fascinating, but still kind of boring. So Higginbottom took it upon himself to build this machine that would play Tennis for Two. And you can find replicas of this in places like the Strong Museum, the Stony Brook University, other such things. I think Brookhaven National Laboratory still has a rebuild of this. Sadly, the original was taken down after 5 years, but literally just built this in order to display the prowess of the hardware they were working at the time. And according to his own comments, children apparently, especially the teenagers, would line up to play this each year. The exact quote, the high schoolers liked it, you couldn't pull them away from it. Which, roaring success.
I would say so. If you encapsulate the teens, then yes.
Yeah, you just have this little push button controller that two people would hold, and really you're just, making sure that this ball, which the first one didn't really have gravity simulated, but eventually would have gravity simulated. You're just trying to make sure that you knock the ball back without directly hitting the net in the middle. But you look at this, and congratulations, you found the origins of Pong.
You don't say.
Yeah, I think we can at least get into the Nolan Bushnell years here through this. So let's talk about the game Space War. I don't really have any great links to show you for Space War because it's mostly books and stuff. But Space War was a program created at MIT in 1962, primarily by Steve Russell, but he had other assistants working with Martin Gretz, Wayne Whitman, Bob Saunders, Steve Piner. Want to be frank, a lot of these names are just drops in the bucket in video game history.
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty sure there is a... Yeah. A video of the original Space War, so there's at least something that I can talk over. Yeah, and this was on the PDP-1. A huge machine worth $120,000 in 1960s money, so a little bit cheaper than your EDSAC and your Ferranti Mark ones, but still kind of expensive boys.
You don't say.
Oh yeah. And as far as they were looking to do something for their graduate thesis together, so they decided to make this game. And for this is honestly the first complex game, you could really say. It had two ships that would circle around a sun. The sun had a gravity pull upon the ships. You had a limited amount of ammo and a limited amount of fuel. And if completely unsure what to do, there was a button that you could hit, a panic button, that would send you somewhere else completely randomly. Yeah, so really, really advanced for the time. Let me see if they have an actual display of the game itself being played. There you go. Yeah, this would be a later rendition of Space War, but still basically the same thing. The sun affects your trajectory, and you have multiple buttons here that can change how your input takes place. So,
Wild.
Nolan Bushnell saw this and just kind of stole it.
Oh, really? You don't say. Nolan Bushnell did something that was marginally gross. Color me shocked.
Yeah, to say that computer space, I didn't even bother to name it anything weird. The great thing was that Space War basically was owned by MIT, and they can't really patent things at a college. So Bushnell saw this when he too was working or was a student. Space War basically made its way through all of the schools that had a PDP-1 and was able to see this for himself and made his own version that honestly better, but still Space War. And you have to give it to Nolan Bushnell in several ways. Like, you had to find a microprocessor that would work in this and build your own custom-built hardware. And this beautiful design came to us by a swimming pool manufacturer that when I heard this, suddenly it fucking explained everything about the design of computer space.
Totally.
Yeah, that is a 1970s pool all over. This came. He was able to see Space War during his time in college, and he wanted to bring this to the masses. So, pinball was, as I said, pinball was largely the primary market of the arcades, shooting galleries, racing games, and other stuff. But he wanted to bring an evolution to the Midway. So he took the idea they had and made a software company, actually I believe became part of a software company called Syzygy Engineering, which when we hit on Atari, we'll have a lot more talk about Syzygy to develop the software that would eventually become Space War. It eventually would roll out to the market. Nutting Associates, by the way, the ones that helped out with the hardware portion of this. If you can say anything about Nolan Bushnell, the man really knew how to sell an idea.
Definitely.
Getting Nutting Associates to work on building this was no small feat either. But yeah, he was able to eventually put out the copy of Space War to a small scale audience. Mostly tried placing these in midways and bars originally, and no one wanted to play it.
Well, I mean, I know this argument has been made many, many times over when it comes to computer space, but considering this, it is the first video game really like that's out there in this way. If you launch anything with the control scheme that this game has, like it looks intimidating as all hell. Especially if you put yourself in the mindset of a bar patron in 1971 who has never seen anything like this before.
Yeah, it's a fun novelty, right? But you take a look at this big old boy. Even to me, I have no idea how this would work, and I've been playing video games for damn near 30 years now. And I look at this and like, this is a monstrous beast of a machine. It is by far leaps and bounds the most complicated thing to come out, and that's to the positive of them, like the ability to keep a score, a time, and all of this, and a full CRT display for 1971 is mind-blowing.
Yeah, no, it is definitely an accomplishment in engineering and manufacturing to get something like that, this like all-encompassing package, and that really does resemble what would come to define an arcade game in that way.
Yeah.
out there so early.
And it's not to say as if this was a failure. A lot of people saw this. A lot of people. And this is what really started what you would call the gaming revolution of the time. Jerry Lawson, who we spoke on episode 0, one of his original games called Tank, is definitely based off of this. But, hey, look, Space Invaders and Asteroids also took some real liberties from this game.
Oh, of course. Of course.
Yeah, especially Asteroids. Asteroids is basically this game, but prettier.
And without a lot of the gravity issues, like
Yeah. Yeah, it's easier to play while it's only a single-player game for Asteroids, which is what really made Asteroids sell better, right? Because you just have 2 buttons, right? You go and you shoot.
Exactly. You took the concept and you simplified it in a way that can speak to someone who doesn't necessarily need to understand computer physics.
Exactly. And yeah, this would eventually lead way to all of your shoot 'em ups that would find your way. So just in these years alone, through the 50s, we've basically seen the progenitors of the 2 biggest games of the 70s, Pong and Space Invaders.
Wild.
Yeah. So I guess next time we'll talk a little bit about the machines that took place at the time, the companies such as Sega, Service Games that would build machines that would run, and how a lot of those companies saw this and started to pivot towards the electronic, the video game, rather than a electronic gaming machine.
Getting into really the birth of an industry here.
Absolutely. As always, if you missed the live stream itself, we'll have the VOD over at youtube.com/CBGB Games. I'll make sure to post it to social medias and whatnot. But yeah, that is, in summation, how we ended up from Alan Turing all the way to Nolan Bushnell, and basically a direct line between the two that gave us the first real commercially marketed video game by the name of Space War. All right. Hey, thanks everyone for joining us. Those who listen, John Borg, Coop, sad you came in just in time for us to go. Thanks thanks everyone, and have a great night.
#ThoughtDub.
Thought dub.